This is the Awakening Chronicles, Book 2, Awakening on Main Street, Chapter 8, Conscious Construction. The dawn light filtered through the scaffolding of the construction site like golden thread through a cosmic loom, casting geometric shadows across the concrete foundation that Leo Thompson had been laying out since 5 in the morning. His grandfather's old level sat warm in his calloused hands, its brass fittings catching the early sun as he checked the alignment on forms that would hold the first floor of what would eventually become something unprecedented in his 30-year career as a contractor, a community center designed not just for function but for the support of consciousness itself. Leo paused in his work, wiping his hands on the canvas apron that belonged to his grandfather before him, feeling the weight of responsibility that had been growing in his chest since the moment he had accepted this project. The blueprints spread across his work table, showing a deceptively simple structure. But Leo knew that every angle, every proportion, every relationship between spaces had been calculated to support the kind of consciousness work they were beginning to develop together. For 3 decades, Leo had built structures that served practical purposes, houses that provided shelter, office buildings that housed commerce, warehouses that stored goods. But this project was different in ways that stretched his understanding of what it meant to be a builder, a craftsman, a servant of human need. The community center was being designed according to principles that he had learned, not from any construction manual, but from mystical experiences he'd shared with the stranger and his 4 friends at the School of the Shadows. The main gathering hall was based in the golden ratio, his dimensions creating natural acoustic properties that would enhance whatever sound healing work Maya might facilitate. The meditation rooms were positioned to catch specific qualities of light at different times in the day, their walls thick enough to provide the silence necessary for deep inner work. But it was the central chamber, what the plan simply labeled as the multi-purpose room. Well, that represented the most ambitious aspect of the project. Leo had designed it according to his understanding of what the stranger had called the 4th room, that mysterious space of potential that existed beyond the ordinary 3 dimensions of human experience. The chamber was circular, with a domed ceiling that followed mathematical principles found in ancient sacred architecture, its acoustic properties carefully calculated to create what could only be described as 3-dimensional mandala of sound and space. His phone buzzed with a text from his foreman, Rick Morales. "Crew's asking about the weird angles again. These plans don't match anything we've built before. You sure the architect knows what he's doing?" Leo smiled as he typed back, "Trust me, the architect knows exactly what he's doing." What he didn't mention was that he was the architect, that he'd drawn these plans himself based on principles that had come to him during weeks of meditation and careful observation of how consciousness seemed to move through physical space. The challenge of translating mystical insights into practical construction specifications had pushed Leo far beyond his usual expertise. He'd spent months studying sacred geometry, researching the acoustic properties of different materials, consulting with engineers who didn't question his unusual request, as long as the structures would be sound and meet building codes. The result was a design that looked conventional enough to satisfy city planners, but was actually a sophisticated instrument for supporting human awakening. Leo's grandfather had always said that the difference between a craftsman and a laborer was attention, the willingness to see each task as an opportunity to serve something larger than immediate necessity. But until his awakening had begun, Leo hadn't understood how profound that service could be. Now, as he checked the alignment of each form, mixed each batch of concrete, cut each piece of lumber, He approached every action as a form of meditation, a way of infusing conscious intention into the physical structure that would house their growing community. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his contemplation, and he looked up to see Joe Martinez walking across the job site carrying 2 cups of coffee and a box of pastries from Meridian Cafe. Joe had begun visiting the construction site every morning for the past 2 weeks, bringing breakfast for Leo and whoever else the group might have happened to have been there. It became an unofficial ritual, a way of maintaining their connection even as they pursued their individual work. "Morning," Joe said, handing Leo one of the steaming cups. "How's the foundation looking?" "Solid," Leo replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Should be ready for the first pour tomorrow if the weather holds." He gestured toward the precisely aligned forms, the carefully calculated angles and curves that would become the base for everything that followed. "But I've been thinking about what the stranger said about the differences between building structures and creating space. There's something here that goes beyond just getting the measurements right." Joe nodded, settling onto an upturned bucket beside Leo's work table. "Like the difference between serving coffee and creating an experience of nourishment. The technical skill is necessary, but it's not sufficient." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Elena showed me some of the readings she's been getting when she visits the site. She says the energy patterns here are unlike anything she's measured in other buildings." "It doesn't surprise me," Leo said, pulling out the plans and pointing to various geometric relationships that governed the design. "Everything here is based on proportions that seem to resonate with something in human consciousness itself. Golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, the harmonic proportions that create natural acoustic resonances." He traced the outline of the central chamber with his finger. "But the real test was how it feels when people actually use the space." Joe looked at the plans with focused attention he'd been developing through his coffee-making practice. "These aren't just blueprints," he observed. "They're almost like musical scores, but for the architecture instead of sound." "Exactly," Leo said, feeling the excitement that came when someone understood what he was trying to accomplish. Music exists in time, architecture exists in space, but both can be designed to support specific states of consciousness. The proportions, the relationships between elements, the light and sound all move through the structure. All of it can either help or hinder the kind of work we're trying to do. Maya arrived shortly after, carrying her violin case and a thermos of tea she had brought for everyone. She'd been coming to the site regularly to test the acoustic properties of the spaces as they took shape, playing in all sorts of different locations, noticing how the evolving architecture affected the sound and resonance of her instrument. "The meditation room is starting to have some interesting acoustic properties," she reported, settling cross-legged on the concrete foundation. "Here's a particular spot near the east wall where the violin seems to gain harmonics that aren't there in other locations. It's subtle, but definitely measurable." Leo nodded, consulting a section of the plans that showed the calculated positions of what he privately called resonance nodes, the points where the geometry of the space would naturally amplify or focus certain frequencies. "That's right where it should be," he said with satisfaction. "The wall thickness changes at that point to create a natural acoustic lens." Elena emerged from the partially framed structure where she'd been taking measurements with her enhanced sensing equipment. "The energy patterns are definitely responding to the construction," she called out, approaching their informal breakfast gathering. "Whatever you're doing here, Leo, it's creating measurable effects on the local electromagnetic field. And the effect seems to be getting stronger as more of the structure goes up." Leo felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with wonder. His grandfather had always insisted that materials would respond to the craftsman's attention, but Leo had assumed this was metaphorical language. Now Elena was providing scientific evidence that conscious attention could actually influence the physical structure of building materials. Tariq arrived last, carrying a notebook filled with observations about humor and community space that he'd been developing for a workshop he'd planned to conduct in the center once it was completed. I've been thinking about the relationship between physical space and psychological openness, he said, accepting the coffee Joe had brought for him. Comedy works best when people feel safe enough to laugh at their own assumptions. Architecture can contribute to that sense of safety. Leo looked around at the four friends who had become his collaborators in this unprecedented project, feeling both gratitude for their support and the weight of responsibility for creating something that would serve their growing community's needs. The construction site had become a laboratory for exploring how consciousness and physical structure interpenetrated, how the built environment could either support or hinder human awakening. Something I need to tell you all, Leo said, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability. And this vulnerability wasn't usually present when he discussed technical aspects of construction. I've never built anything like this before. The principles that I'm working with, the proportions and relationships I'm trying to create, they're based on insights from our experiences with the stranger, but I have no guarantee they'll work the way that I hope they will. He gestured toward the foundation forms, the carefully calculated curves and angles that represented months of planning and preparation. I keep on having moments of doubt, wondering if I'm making it too complicated. If I should just build a conventional community center and trust that the consciousness work will happen regardless of the physical environment. Joe looked up from his coffee with the expression of someone who recognized familiar terrain. That sounds like the voice that keeps telling me I'm not qualified to serve the awakening through something as ordinary as making coffee. The voice says that the inner work is separate from the outer work. But you've proven that wrong, Maya said, her musician's air catching the harmony between their different challenges. Every cup of coffee you make with conscious intention becomes a small ceremony. There's no reason Leo's his construction work can't be the same thing, but on a larger scale. Elena opened her notebook and showed them some of the energy pattern readings she'd been documenting through the construction process. The data suggests that consciousness and the physical structure do interact in measurable ways. She said, your intuitions about sacred geometry and acoustic properties are showing up as objective changes in the local energy field. Tariq leaned back against the stack of lumber, his comedian's mind working with the paradox of doubt and confidence that seemed to be part of everyone's awakening process. You know what's funny, he said? We're all terrified that we're not qualified to do what we feel called to do, but maybe that's exactly what makes us qualified. People who think that they already know everything don't learn new things. Leo felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. His friends were right. The doubt he was experiencing wasn't evidence that he was unqualified for this work, but rather a sign that he was taking it seriously, approaching it with the humility necessary for genuine service. The thing that scares me most, he admitted, is the possibility that I'll make mistakes that affect other people's spiritual development. If someone comes here looking for healing or awakening and the space I've created somehow hinders that process, then we'll learn from it and we'll do it better next time, Maya said simply. Stranger never promised that awakening wouldn't be risk-free. He taught us that consciousness development requires willingness to experiment, to make some mistakes, to keep adjusting our approach based on what we learn. Elena nodded, adding her scientist perspective. In research, negative results are still results. They tell us something important about how systems work. If aspects of the architecture doesn't support consciousness the way we hope that it will, We'll modify, or we'll design differently next time. Joe stood up and walked to the edge of the foundation, looking over the structure that was beginning to take shape. I think the real question isn't whether you're qualified to build this place, he said. It's whether we're all qualified to use it well once it's finished. The consciousness work we do here will be at least as important as the architecture that houses it. Leo joined Joe at the foundation's edge, looking out over the construction site with eyes that had been trained by 30 years of turning plans into three-dimensional reality. But now he was seeing the enhanced vision, recognizing that every beam that he placed, every angle he cut, every surface he finished was participating in the creation of something unprecedented, a physical space specifically designed to support the awakening of human consciousness. You know what my grandfather used to say? Leo asked, his voice carrying the weight of inherited wisdom. He said that the best buildings were the ones that made people feel more like themselves, not necessarily more comfortable or more impressed, but more authentically who they were meant to be. Tariq smiled, recognizing the deeper humor in this observation. So you're building a space that will help people remember who they are. That's exactly what the stranger has been teaching us to do for ourselves. And for each other, Maya added, her musician's understanding of harmony extending to the relationship between individual development and the collective support. The architecture is just another instrument in the orchestra we're learning to play together. Elena closed her notebook and looked around at the site with fresh anticipation for what Leo was accomplishing. From a systems perspective, you're creating a positive feedback loop between physical structure and consciousness development. Space will support the work, and the work will energize the space, and both will evolve together. As they continued their morning conversation, other members of the construction crew began arriving for the day's work. Leo had been gradually introducing consciousness principles into the construction process itself, encouraging the workers to approach their tasks with the same attention and care he was bringing to his own work. The response had been mixed. Some crew members were intrigued by the idea of construction as spiritual practice. Others remained focused on practical concerns like schedules and paychecks. But even the most pragmatic workers had begun to notice that there was something different about this job site. Tools rarely went missing, injuries were surprisingly rare, and the quality of work seemed to improve naturally as people became more engaged with the project's larger purpose. Rick Morales, the foreman, had privately told Leo that this was the smoothest construction process he'd ever supervised in 20 years, though he couldn't explain why. All right, Leo said, standing up and reaching for his tool belt. Time to get to work. We're pouring the first section of foundation today, and I want every cubic foot of concrete to be placed with conscious intention. Joe gathered up the empty coffee cups while Maya packed her violin, and Elena showed the measurements of her, or stowed the measurements from the equipment. They had all learned to start their days together at the construction site, using the morning gathering as a way to align their individual work with their collective purpose. Same time tomorrow, Joe asked, though they all knew the question had become rhetorical. The morning ritual had evolved naturally, without planning or formal agreement, as things do when they serve a genuine need. Same time tomorrow, Leo confirmed, but his attention was already turning to the day's task. There were forms to check, concrete to pour, and dozens of details to coordinate. But now he approached each task with the understanding that he wasn't just building a structure, he was participating in the creation of a sacred space that would serve human awakening for years to come. As his friends dispersed, to their own work, Leo walked to the perimeter of the foundation one final time, checking alignments and making small adjustments. Each measurement that he took carried the weight of intention beyond structural necessity. Each angle verified for its capacity to support consciousness as well as physical loads. The work itself became a form of meditation as Leo lost himself in the rhythm of construction. Each board he cut, each nail he drove, each surface he leveled became an opportunity to practice presence, to infuse conscious intention into physical matter. His grandfather had taught him that good construction required attention to detail, but Leo was discovering that sacred construction required attention to the present moment, to the quality of awareness that he brought to each action. By mid-morning, the concrete trucks arrived, and Leo supervised the pouring of the first section of the foundation with the intensity of a conductor leading a symphony. Every detail mattered. The consistency of the mix, the timing of the pour, the careful vibration that eliminated air bubbles and the ensuing uniform density. But far beyond the technical requirements, Leo was well aware that in something ceremonial, creating the physical foundation that would support years of consciousness work and community development. As the concrete flowed into the forms he had so carefully aligned, Leo felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. He was witnessing the transformation of his violin into three-dimensional reality, seeing the principles he had learned from the stranger and his friends take physical form in the steel and concrete and careful craftsmanship. The afternoon brought Elena with more sophisticated monitoring equipment than she usually brought to the site. "I want to document the energy patterns while the concrete's still setting," she explained to Leo as she began to placing sensors at various points around the foundation. There may be a window of time when the material is most receptive to whatever consciousness influences you're trying to build into the structure. Maya and Tariq arrived together, having spent the lunch break exploring how music and humor could work together in the spaces Leo was creating. They brought fresh perspective on how the architecture might support different types of community gatherings, from intimate conversations to large group celebrations. As the group progressed and the concrete continued to set in its carefully aligned forms, Elena's measurements began showing patterns that shouldn't have been present in ordinary construction. "This is remarkable," she said, studying her readouts with growing excitement. "The molecular alignment of the concrete is showing patterns that correlate with the sacred geometry proportions Leo built into the foundation design." "What does this mean practically?" Maya asked her musician's mind, interested in the implications of her own work with sound and consciousness. Elena adjusted her equipment to take more detailed measurements. "It suggests that Leo's approach to construction is actually altering the fundamental properties of the material that he's working with. The concrete isn't just meeting structural specifications, it's becoming something qualitatively different, something that may be more supportive of consciousness work than ordinary building materials." Tariq laughed with genuine delight at the implications. "So you're not just building a community center," he said to Leo. "You're creating a new kind of building material, consciousness-infused concrete. We should patent the process." But Leo was thinking about more serious implications. If conscious attention could influence the molecular structure of material during construction, then every building project was potentially a form of spiritual practice, an opportunity to infuse physical structures with qualities that would support human flourishing. "This changes everything," Leo said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "If we can prove that conscious construction creates qualitatively different buildings, If we can develop methods for measuring and replicating these effects, we could transform how people think about architecture and urban planning. Joe nodded, recognizing the parallel to his own work, like the difference between providing caffeine and creating an experience of nourishment. Most buildings provide shelter and function, but they could provide something more, spaces that actively support human development and awakening. As the workday ended and as the concrete hardened into the foundation that would support everything to come, Leo felt the satisfaction of someone who had successfully merged vision with practical action. The community center was still months from completion, but its essential nature was already establishing itself in physical reality. The evening light slanted across the job site as Leo picked up his tools, each instrument cleaned and organized with care of someone who understood that tools were an extension of consciousness, that the quality of attention brought to maintenance affected the quality of work they could accomplish. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they moved to the foundation, working to framing, each phase of construction offering new opportunities to explore how consciousness could influence physical structure. But Leo was no longer approaching the project with extreme anxiety that had once plagued him earlier that morning. His friends had shown him that doubt and confidence could coexist, that the willingness to experiment with an unknown possibility was in itself a form of service. You know, Elena said as they prepared to leave the site, we're not just building a community center, we're crafting or creating a prototype for what architecture could become when it's designed for and constructed with conscious intention. Leo looked at his friends with growing appreciation for how their individual effort and work was beginning to weave together into something larger than any of them could accomplish alone. The community center would house Maya's sound healing works, support Tariq's consciousness-orientated comedy, provide space for Elena's research into the intersection of science and spirituality, and serve as a gathering place for the kind of community building that Joe was facilitating through his coffee service. As they walked away from the construction site, Leo, he looked back on the foundation that was solid now beneath the evening sky. Tomorrow would bring vertical elements, walls and beams, and the complex geometry that would shape interior space. But the foundation had been created today. It was much more than just concrete and rebar. It was the physical manifestation of their shared commitment to exploring what became possible when consciousness, work, and practical service were unified in pursuit of something larger than the individual could accomplish alone. The city hummed around him with its usual rhythms, millions of people moving through built environments that had been created without conscious attention to their effects on human development and awakening. But Leo and his friends were pioneering a different approach, proving that it was possible to create physical spaces that actively supported the evolution of human consciousness. The great work was no longer just individual awakening. It was becoming the collective creation, the conscious construction of environments that would serve awakening for years to come. And Leo Thompson, master craftsman and servant of human potential, was building the foundation for a future that most people couldn't yet imagine, but was already taking shape in concrete and steel in the careful application of consciousness to the ancient art of construction.